the title of this class session is More Offerings and Sacrifices. So for those who weren't here, later this week, both last week's Bible class and this week's Bible class recordings will be put online. All right, so you can go back and catch up if you missed. But just a way of remembering for us, or a little bit of an introduction for those of you who were not able to be here last week. Last week we did a little introduction to Leviticus, and we looked at chapter 1, which covers the burnt offering. Today we're going to look at the other offerings or sacrifices that were commonplace within their worship and ritual life. All right, so a couple of things just to help us keep our frame set here. Leviticus has to do with two things: God's desire to dwell and live amongst his people, even though he is holy and they are sinful. So that's why he deals in great detail with the offerings and the sacrifice, because his heart, his desire is, I want to dwell and live among my people. I am their God and they are my people. That's what Mount Sinai was all about, okay? We all know God is holy, people are sinful. So how do we get to that reconciled relationship? One of the other things we talked about is if you look in a study Bible and you got a picture of the tabernacle, God in Exodus tells the people how to build the tabernacle. It's in the middle of all the tribes. They are assigned locations. So when they are camping out, they all have, this tribe is here, this tribe is there, and it all creates a square around the tabernacle so that God is in the middle of his people. And when they journey and they roll up, for lack of a better word, the tabernacle and carry it, or Levites carry it, the people march around it, and it's always in the middle, representing God's presence with his people. The second half of Leviticus has to do with God giving, sometimes they're called ceremonial or purity laws. Sometimes commentators will call them the holiness code or holiness laws. And what it has to do with is God says, I am holy. That's in the book of Leviticus. Therefore, you as my people will live as holy people. Holy, in a literal sense in the Old Testament, means set apart or distinct, separate. Right? God is, that's why we have, in English, we have the expression holy other, right? Like, God is separate and distinct from any other being in all existence, right? And so he's telling his people, Israel, you belong to me, so you need to be holy, set apart, distinct from all other religions and peoples on the earth, because you represent a holy God to them, right? So the second half of Leviticus becomes all of these rules and laws that distinguish the people of Israel and how they live in their daily lives from the nations around them, right? So that's kind of like, if you wanted to divide Leviticus into two sections, that's what you would do. Along the way, you get subsections, and that's kind of how I'm going to teach it to you. Rather than chapter by chapter, we're going to do major sections, right? So today, we're looking at the sections of chapters 2 through roughly 7. All right, if you want to read on your own throughout the week, super fun stuff. All right, we're going to look at the offerings, and I'm not going to read these word for word for you. Like last week, I didn't read word for word because it does get repetitive. I understand that. I love the book, but I also understand why. You start reading, and you're like, oh, okay, do this and then that, okay, and if you get a different animal or different thing, do this and that. The other thing about Leviticus, like if you're doing that, I'm reading the Bible in a year thing, which is awesome. If you have that as a goal, more power to you, right? Leviticus is where everybody falls apart and they're like, oh, Genesis was neat, Exodus, the golden calf, I remember that from Sunday school. Now we have blood, guts, and fire, and it's a little weird, okay? What happens is, even when I see people that are like, because I've had people come up to me very proudly in my time as a pastor, they're like, I started reading, and I'm like, awesome, and then they come back, I quit. I'm like, that's all right, God loves you anyway. Okay, because what happens is it gets repetitive. So these first few chapters that we're going to look at start talking about these sacrifices or offerings, right, that you can make, that God implements for his people to be able to worship him properly, receive his gifts of grace and mercy and reconciliation with each other. It's very beautiful. And then you get to chapter 7, and he repeats himself. It just becomes, chapter 1 was about the burnt offering. Guess what chapter 7 starts talking about? Burnt offering all over again. You're like, oh, I just read that. And it becomes more detailed. The most commentators say the reason for that is because 1 through 6 is kind of this general overview of, for all the people, kind of have a basic idea of here's what I want you to do. Beginning in 7, he starts talking directly to Aaron and the priests. And so it becomes more detailed of, since they're the ones either doing or assisting the people with the offerings to make sure they happen correctly, he gives them a lot more detail. So then I've had a lot of people are like, I made it through a few chapters, and then they get to that, and they're like, and then it just started saying the same stuff again. I'm like, I know. Isn't it great? And then they're like, no, and they move on. And that's okay. So I just wanted to give you that brief little overview of how we understand this. At the heart of it is God wanting to be a holy God who dwells among his sinful people. He wants to be their God. And then he gives them instructions on, here's how I want you to live so you can represent me well to the rest of the world. All right. So last week was the burnt offering. This week we're going to look at all the other ones. Okay. Now, when I say offerings and sacrifices, these are the ones we're talking about. There are other rituals that you are probably a little more familiar with in the Old Testament that Jesus did in the New Testament. Those are the festivals, right? So you get Passover. That's a sacrifice, but it's considered a festival because it's a week-long thing. It's not one day. It's a week-long. You get the Day of Atonement. Now, that's one day, and that's from Leviticus. All right, and we'll talk about that because that's kind of a huge one. And then you got the Feast of Booths, or Tabernacles, or if you want to be fancy, Sukkot. All right, and that's another festival that was from the Old Testament. Jesus participated in. All right, and so you get all of these different things. What's happening here in these opening chapters of Leviticus are not those. These are more of the regular kind of ritual. Those things are, like Passover is once a year, and it's a huge deal, right? Sukkot is once a year, and it's a huge deal. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, it's once a year, it's a huge deal, right? These are happening very regularly, right? So these are like the daily rhythms or the weekly rhythms of the people. Does that make sense? All right, so don't get too confused on that part. All right, so chapter 2 has to deal with what is called the grain offering. Now, I'm going to give you very basic names because if you start reading, and especially start reading commentaries, because words can be translated in different ways, some of these have multiple names, and I'm trying to not confuse you as best I can. All right, so this offering is called the Mincha offering. All right, so the bold underlined words are Hebrew words for you to brag to your friends about that you know stuff, okay? So Mincha, it's sometimes called a gift offering, all right? Or a thank offering, but it's the grain offering because it uses grain rather than an animal, okay? And these offerings that were looked at in chapter 1 and here today, they all have different purposes or reasons that God gave to them and why the people would do them, right? So Mincha is the same root as the Hebrew word for joy. So it's a joyful, thankful offering. Okay, this is not a obligatory, I'm a terrible person and I want to apologize to God for it, so here's my offer. This is just a woo! God's good. He's blessed me. I'm giving thanks. I'm joyful. All right. All right. It is an offering of grain mixed with oil and sometimes frankincense. All right. Throughout the Old Testament, in addition to it being an offering that people gave to God here, it's also a word that is used throughout the Old Testament when people would give gifts or offerings or tribute to kings or foreign kings. You would present a mincha offering. It's a gift offering, a thank offering. Now, you can quibble about if a foreign king conquered you and you give him a thank offering, like how thankful are you? Really, you're like, we love you so much, don't kill us, kind of thing. All right, okay. But this is how it's used throughout the Old Testament. It's always a gift out of joy. It's a gift. It's a thankful thing. All right. Now, one of the things for us as people that know the New Testament, we're just coming out of Christmas. One of the gifts brought by the wise men is frankincense, right? Because it's a gift that is brought to kings. Okay, and it's also used by the priests in the offering. So there's this double meaning of the gift of frankincense to Jesus is we recognize him as a king, and he's a priestly king. All right, so there's a lot going on there. Thanks, Leviticus. Making Christmas even cooler. Technically, that's Epiphany, which was last week, so we're not too far off. There you go. See, church calendar. I'm bringing it all together for you. You're welcome. All right. So Leviticus 2, 1 through 3, it says, when anyone brings a grain offering as an offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour. He shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it and bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, and he shall take from it a handful of the fine flour and oil with all of its frankincense, and the priest shall burn this as its memorial portion on the altar, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Now, last week we talked about the burnt offering, which is centered on this phrase, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. This is a very common phrase in Leviticus. It's a very common phrase when it comes to offerings and sacrifices that God instituted. And the idea is to give you an image that when it's being burned, the smoke kind of becomes an incense that goes up to the Lord, and it's a reminder that the Lord is pleased with me. Okay? For us in the New Testament, especially Revelation, we talked about this last week, we have this picture of the prayers of the saints ascending to the Lord as like an incense or an aroma pleasing to him. So we're like, oh, we're not burning offerings anymore. But it becomes a picture for us, a reminder that when I pray, my prayers ascend to the throne of God. He is pleased with me. He hears my prayer. And I always encourage people to remember that, because I love praying for you and with you, and I do it a lot, and I will continue to do it because I love y'all. But I don't have special powers, okay? Like your prayers make it all the way up to Jesus, just like mine, okay? All right? But Leviticus, these sacrifices and offerings give us that foreshadowing, this reminder that this is acceptable to the Lord, what I've brought to him, and he is pleased with me. He enjoys it. That's this phrase. An aroma pleasing to the Lord. The way to remember it is if you like barbecue and you're cooking, or you got a neighbor, you're walking around the neighborhood and you smell how good it smells. You're like, and then you get real hungry, but you enjoy the smell, right? And it's pleasing to you. That's what this is. So there you go. You get an everyday reminder of what God feels like when you pray to him. All right, it's this pleasing thing. All right. And then in verse 3, but the rest of the grain offering shall be for Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy part of the Lord's food offering. Now, not going to dive super deep into that phrase, but just very quickly, here's the reality. When the people of Israel entered the promised land, it was divided up. Now, thankfully, we have study Bibles and things like that with maps, and they're color-coded so we can keep it straight, all right? And part of the job of Joshua when he was leading the people of Israel through the conquest of the promised land, he was basically, they would go into one area, and this was the area for Gad, or this is the area for Dan, and they would conquer the people, kick them out. Now you get a whole problems because they don't listen to God fully, which is like the whole story of humanity in a nutshell. And so they divide it all up. The Levites, the tribe of Levi, which is Moses and Aaron's tribe, all the way back to Jacob, all right, they don't get any land. That's intentional from God. So we say the 12 tribes of Israel because there are 12 sons of Israel. If you read the end of Genesis, it gets real confusing real fast because a couple of them get kicked out for being really sinful and really bad. And then Joseph's like, well, I got 2 kids. And so those grandkids become the 2 extra tribes of Israel. And Levi, as one of the tribes, gets zero land because they are, our word for holy, set apart by God. And a big reason for this is because of the story of the golden calf. Okay, if you're familiar with the story of the golden calf, it's a really bad thing that happened. Okay, it's 40 days after the Red Sea. You'd think they're like, that was pretty cool. We're going to hang out with God. Moses goes on a mountain. They're like, it's been a month. Aaron, make us a new god. And so they make the golden calf. Now, they didn't make a solid gold calf. Most likely what they made is a wooden one, and then it's covered in thin gold stuff, right? And they begin to worship it. And they say about the golden calf, or Aaron says to them, this is your God who brought you out of Egypt, which is how God is described. This is why God gets so angry. He says, no, it's not just idolatry. It's a complete replacement. It says, this golden calf brought you out of Egypt. And God's like, no, it didn't. I did that. So Moses comes down. He smashes the 10 Commandment tablets. He makes a soup out of that and the golden calf and makes the people drink it. So if you ever had your mouth washed out with soap as a kid, this is like the biblical proportions version of that. Now, here's the part that is not told in the Sunday school classrooms on flannel graph to the little kids. God tells Moses, you and the Levites arm yourselves with swords and kill the people. And so they run to the camp of the people that worship the golden calf, and they slaughter over 3,000 of them that night. And God says, you're going to be my priest because you didn't bow down and you were zealous for me. So the Levites are separated out and distinct from the rest of the people of Israel, the rest of the tribes, because they have a zealousness for God's holiness. You see this in the life of Jesus when he goes into the temple and he turns over the tables, and he doesn't just do that. He makes a whip and he starts hitting people with it to kick them out because they have turned the house of God into a house of robbers or thieves, right? And then John's gospel has a parenthetical statement that says, because it took the disciples a while to get everything right, okay, says, oh, and we remember the scripture that says from the Old Testament, zeal for your house will consume me. Right? That's what the Levites are like. They have this zeal, this, it's where we get our word zealot from, an extremist. They are extremists for the holiness of God. So God separates them out. So when they get to the promised land, you get no land, which is kind of a big bummer back then, because how do you survive back then? Land. All right, everything is land-based. All right, so how do the Levites get taken care of? It's by the offerings of the people. And this is why Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians. He talks about how the workers are to be cared for by the people, because that's the inheritance of the people of Israel is the promised land. The inheritance for the Levites is the offerings. So oftentimes what you're going to see in Leviticus, if you read it on your own, is some of the sacrifices offerings, like the burnt offering, the whole thing goes to God. Other times, some of it goes to God, and then like with the grain offering, another part of it goes to the Levites and the priests so that they can survive. It's the way they are cared for. All right, does that make sense? Okay, and that's the history of that. So that's why he says that part of the grain offering goes to God, part of it goes to Aaron and his sons. Aaron and his sons is a generalized statement of the priests, because to be a priest, you had to be part of Aaron's family line. Aaron is kind of a good high priest. He messes up kind of like his brother Moses messes up quite a bit, but God uses them. His sons, not so great, okay? But it is set up by God that the descendants of Aaron are the priests and the high priests, okay? All right, the purpose of this offering is worship, not atonement, right? So sometimes because of Christ on the cross, this is not a bad thing, we hear the word sacrifice and we automatically think what? Atonement, forgiveness of sins, right? The grain offering, not all the offerings and sacrifices were used in that way. The grain offering, like I said, it's rooted in the word joy, thanksgiving. This is, we did the burnt offering where I'm atoned for, my sins are forgiven. I'm giving thanks to God for all that he has done for me. Right? That's the balance here. That's why it's the second one in the burnt offering. Hey, look, you're forgiven. Chapter 2. You should probably tell God thank you. Right? Like, whoo, so we have joy because of God's grace and forgiveness, and now we worship him and praise him. So Leviticus 2 verse 13, you shall season all your grain offerings with salt. You shall not let the salt of the covenant with your God be missing from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt. Now why do I bring this up? Because Jesus. That's just go with Jesus for the rest of this class. Those will be good answers, all right? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has a teaching about salt. Remember? And he says, if salt loses its saltiness, it's worthless, it should be cast out. And it's basically making an illustration that if like we lose that, what good do we have? Now there's a lot going on with that statement. It's a whole other Bible class. But one of the things that Jesus is doing is he's calling back to the grain offering where we live these lives of thanksgiving and joy because of God. Have you ever noticed how joy is contagious? Happiness is contagious. And then the opposite is also true. Misery loves company. Which is why if you're trying to be miserable, and you all know what I'm talking about, you got those days where like, I just want to pout, right? And then you got a friend that's like, hey, everything's great. The sun's shining. It's not 9 degrees. And you're like, shut up. We're supposed to be miserable right now, right? So you're all laughing because we know it's true. So when Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is telling you to live this salty life, live with saltiness, don't lose it, it's going back to the grain offering, which is all about joy and thanksgiving to God for what he has done. And God gives this command, make sure that offering always has salt. And Jesus is saying, hey, hold on to that joy and that thanksgiving for what God has done for you, because that is what's going to be contagious. That's what's going to draw people to God, which is why the next illustration uses is light, and he says, if you let your light shine, it'll attract people, right? Does that make sense? All right. So that's the mincha, that's the grain offering. The next offering, like I said, they have multiple names. It's sometimes called the peace or the fellowship offering. The word is shalomim. It comes from the word shalom. So there you go. Make it easier to remember. All right. A peace offering, part of which was burned on the altar, and the remainder was eaten by the priest and the one who offered the sacrifice. So they kind of do it together. You eat a little bit, God gets a little bit, and the priest who helps you as a mediator gets a little bit. All right, so everybody's they're eating it together. Now, I have on your notes Genesis 37, verse 4. This is part of the story of Joseph and his brothers, which is, like almost like a third of the whole book of Genesis is about them and their terrible family relationships. So if you ever feel bad about how your family's going, just read about Joseph and his brothers. You'll be like, we're not really that terrible. You'll feel a lot better. Okay. In Genesis 37, verse 4, there's this statement where it says that his brothers could not speak peaceably with him, right? And that animosity, that conflict, even all these years later, is still there. The word where it says they couldn't speak peaceably is shalomim. It's the same word as this offering. The whole point of this offering is reconciliation. Not just between God, but between God and people and people and people, which is why you ate it with the priest and you would eat it with anybody that came with you. Okay, that's why there's this communal eating together. The 7th chapter, like I said, right, I warned you, chapter 7 kind of starts repeating everything. Leviticus says that after the specified portions of the fellowship or the peace offering were burned on the altar. The rest of the animal was cooked as a meal for the worshiper, for the priest, and for other people. So basically, if we're not at peace with one another, but we want to reconcile, we bring our offering to God. The priest helps us with it. We have peace with God now, and we're saying by eating this meal together, we have peace with one another. So we eat the meal together and celebrate. There's peace between us and God and each other. It's a meal of reconciliation. Now, few things about the Shalomim, the peace or the fellowship offering, just to try to help you bring it into the New Testament. One is Jesus has a statement where he says, where two or more are gathered in my name, there I am also. Now, how many of you have heard that one? Now, how many of you have ever done a Bible study, church thingy, anything, and there's only 2 or 3 of you, and someone said it out loud, so you felt better? I've done it too. You're like, yeah, but, Jesus says 2 or 3. It's 1, 2, 3. That counts. All right. It's a beautiful verse. It has nothing to do with church worship or your gathering. It has to do with church discipline and church reconciliation between people who have sinned against one another. Oh no, now I don't want to quote it anymore. All right. In that same passage, it's in the Gospel of Matthew. You can read it, Matthew 18. Jesus says, if you have a problem with your brother or sister, make peace with each other before you bring your offering to the Lord. And then he goes on, and eventually you get to the whole 2 or more. It meant authoritative. All right. Jesus is referring to this offering. Like, don't come and bring your grain offering and act like, I just love the Lord and everything's great, when you are not so great and you got some stuff between you and others, right? This is why the Apostle John in his letter says, you cannot love God and hate your brother. And he says, if you do, you don't know the Lord. It's hard. And you're like, well, they did this to me. Yeah. Which is why God gave us the peace offering. We even have that expression, right? Hey, I'm going to make a peace offering, the olive branch, those kinds of things. It comes from here. Because God knew, hey, sin doesn't just create a problem between us and God. Have you noticed that? It'd be really convenient if it did, right? Because you're just like, well, I did confession, and we are good. A lot of times, almost all the time, your sin or their sin creates problems between you and other people. And so we needed offering, we needed a way to create peace, not just with us and God, but with us and other people. Right? And if you look at our world today, everybody goes, oh, Leviticus don't matter. How much division do you think is in our world right now? How wonderful would it be if people got together and said, let's reconcile. We even have the expression, let's get together and break some bread. Right? Because God knows, hey, you're going to have issues with one another. So I'm going to give you a way to have peace with one another. So there's a wonderful story in Luke 15. You're much more familiar with it than Leviticus. It's called the story of the prodigal son. It's part of Luke 15, which is all about, it's sometimes nicknamed the lost chapter because you get the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. We all know this story, right? Son tells the father, I wish you were dead. I'd rather have my inheritance. He gets a portion of the inheritance because 2/3 of it would go to the eldest son because that's how it worked back then. I tell my dad, hey, man, it don't work that way no more. He laughs. Anyway, I'm the youngest. Anyway, the son leaves. He falls apart. Interesting thing about the son, he doesn't return because he loves the father. He returns because his life goes to hell. And he's like, being a servant, a slave in my father's house would be better than this, right? So he comes back. And the beauty of the story is the father's love. He runs to his son and says, welcome home. And then he says, gather the fattened calf and let's sacrifice it and have a party because my son who was gone is home again. By the way, the background for that story and why Jesus chooses the fattened calf as language and not the Passover lamb is the peace offering. Because this was what you did. You brought the fattened calf out and said, we're going to have this meal. And it's not just for the priest. It's not just for the person bringing it. It's for everybody that they invite. And so does the Father do. He invites everybody and says, my son is home. He's not my servant. He's not my slave. He's my son. So we're going to celebrate it. And then the really interesting thing, if you read this whole little chapter here in chapter 3 of Leviticus, because there's, if you remember from last week, there's tiers of animals, depending on how wealthy you were. He sacrifices the fattened calf and says, everybody come and celebrate because I have reconciled with my lost son, right? It's a peace offering meal. The oldest son, who, by the way, also doesn't love the father, he just goes about it in a different way, stands outside pouting, and he complains to his father, and he says, you never even gave me a goat. A goat is a smaller animal than the fattened calf. It's a lesser thing, right? So he's complaining and like, I didn't even get this. And then the father says to him, hey, everything I have is already yours. Meaning we were never unreconciled. We were never separated. You were already living with me. The whole background of that story is the peace offering. Everybody get in here. I've reconciled with my son. He's back home. All right. So God is giving us a way through these sacrifices, a way to worship him with the thank offering, the mincha, with the burnt offering, get our sins atoned for between us and him. And the shalom is now we can reconcile with one another. Kleinig, who is the author of the CPH commentary on Leviticus, it's a wonderful book. Just saying. You can get it. They sell it on their website. Says this about this offering. It says, in his love, he, that is God, established a holy meal for his people by the institution of the peace offerings. He was their divine host at this meal. It's a cool description of what's going on here. You show up with your sacrifice. The priest helps you do it. God gets part of it. So in a way, God is eating some of it. The priest eats some of it. You eat some of it, and everybody else. It's a divine meal that we're having together. This is also one of the backgrounds of what we call communion. Sometimes communion is referred to as Eucharist, Thanksgiving. It's a meal for making peace. The reason you get the name communion is because we're in community with one another. We have a common fellowship together. The fellowship of this altar. The reason we get all that language, it comes from this. This is a precursor, along with Passover, of what happens in communion is not only you and God being made right through Jesus. It's the person kneeling at the altar right next to you, right? We're in it together. So part of the power and the importance of communion and why it should be protected within the church in terms of how we take it and who receives it and those kinds of things is that it's not just about your personal relationship with the Lord. It's also about, it's a fellowship meal. It's also about your relationship with the members of the church, all right? Which is why in the early church, I always chuckle, y'all don't do this to me, but other people do, when they're like, I wish we could just go back to the basics of the early church. And anytime anybody says that to me, I know immediately they haven't read a darn thing about the early church. Okay? It was messed up, it was messy, and it was filled with sinners. And 2,000 years later, we're following in their footsteps just fine. So you're there, baby. Okay, you're in it. You're as early as it gets in the early church. Now, the other reason this comes up to me by people is, who are you as a pastor to say someone can't take communion? Which also tells me you haven't read the New Testament at all. All right? And there's a whole bunch that goes back there. That one of them is this. No, this is a fellowship meal, meaning when you take it with us, you are saying, I'm at peace with this church, and I believe what they believe. We're in this together, okay? Now, the reason people that don't like that rule go, oh, we should just go back to the early church, because they think it was like the frontier of Christianity, and it was just the Wild West, just do whatever you want. In fact, and you can read it in the Didache, which is the teaching of the early church. It's a document that still exists today. It's within 100 years of Jesus. In the early church, when they did communion, they kicked every single person out of the sanctuary or out of the worship room that was not a Christian or a member of that church. So if you were a guest or you were a non-believer just checking it out, they saved communion for the very end of the service, and they said, thanks for coming, goodbye now. And they would kick everybody out, close the doors, and then do communion as an intimate family meal. Now imagine if we started doing that, because everybody's like, we want to go back to the church. I was like, all right, well, if you're a guest, bye. We're locking the doors. Why? Because we're going to do communion. Well, I want communion. Well, you said you wanted the early church. Anyway, that's my little rant. The practice of communion is based in the peace offering, though, or the fellowship offering. That represents we have peace with God, we have peace and fellowship with one another. Does that make sense? All right. All right. Next offering. We're rolling along. Chatat. It's a fun word. Chatat. It's a chay in Hebrew. So our professors always made us practice these things. Chatat is the word for sin. So this is commonly called the sin offering. And I'm going to talk about why that's kind of a problem. Because later on in Leviticus, remember what I said, starting in chapter 7, it just starts repeating with extended details. One of the extended details with the chatat offering, the sin offering, is that it was also to be made not always when someone sinned, but there's details about when a woman gave childbirth, they would have to go and make a chatat offering, when other stuff happened. And so it became also part of a purity offering. Something became ceremonial unclean, we'll make a chatat. So some scholars will say calling it a sin offering, especially for New Testament Christians, isn't 100% accurate, because it was also given even when someone hadn't sinned. By the way, the birth of Jesus, Mary and Joseph go to the temple, and it says they do everything required of them for purification within the law. It's not talking about Jesus there. That meant Mary. They made a chatat offering, and they give turtle doves because they were poor. And God said, if you're poor, you can make it a bird offering. So the more you know. All right, so Mary made a chatat offering after Jesus was born. All right, it's also, though, a sin offering. Now, how many of you have heard the phrase, all sin is the same in the eyes of God? Raise your hands. All right. I'm going to rock your world right now. Get ready. That's not in the Bible, and it's not true. Okay. You can email me later this week with why you think it is true. All right, that verse, that teaching is not in the Bible. Now, does the Bible say we all sin and fall short of the glory of God and we all need salvation? Absolutely, yes. All right, so I'm not quibbling about that. All right, what I'm saying is if you read especially Old Testament, and the laws for the sin offering are different than the laws for the guilt offering that we're going to talk about in a moment, it's not all the same. God has different regulations and rules. The sin offering is given for what we would call accidental transgressions, sins of ignorance. Okay? So I didn't know that rule. Well, you did it anyway. Okay, so I'll go make a chatat offering. All right, does that make sense? Versus, I'm going to intentionally harm this person or steal from them, or I'm going to intentionally break one of the 10 Commandments. Well, then you got to make a different kind of offering for that one, you heathen. Okay? But the chatat, the sin offering, it's used for two things. Ceremonial purity kind of stuff that needs to be taken care of to remain clean or holy in the eyes of God. And then what is accidental sin. So verses 11 and 12 here are Leviticus. Yeah, interesting. But the skin of the bull and all its flesh, with its head, its legs, its entrails, this is fun, and its dung, all the rest of the bull he shall carry outside the camp to a clean place, to the ash heap, and shall burn it up on a fire of wood. On the ash heap it shall be burned up. So this is what this represents. The reason I read that, and I know it's a gross verse, okay. Some of the offerings, it was almost like a party, right? We're burning it, we're eating the grain, or we're eating the animal. This is great. Here, what is happening is a word that we often don't use in the church anymore, which is sad. It's a word called expiation. Okay. So the fancy word for Jesus dying on the cross to forgive your sins, to be the sacrifice for you, depending on the English translations, if they use it or not, is propitiation, right? He is the payment. He is the sacrifice. We're all familiar with that language. There's another word that comes from sacrifice language here in Leviticus called expiation. Propitiation has to do with you owe a debt because of your sin, right? You owe God. The wages of sin is death. That's your debt. Propitiation says the debt has been paid. Jesus made it for you. Okay. Some sin, though, right? So that's almost like guilt. Like, I did something wrong. I got to make up for it. There's another word in English called shame, where you do something and it mars your identity. You feel ashamed of who you are. Or a sin has happened to you and it makes you feel unclean. You feel ashamed, right? Expiation has to do with the idea of God takes away your shame. So I just read these really gross verses about you're going to take the entrails and the dung and all this other stuff, and you take it out there. The out there was away from the camp, away from where the offerings are made. It's a physical representation of God saying, and here's what I'm doing with your uncleanness and your sin. I am taking it, I'm carrying it away. So you can't see it anymore. And we're going to burn it up while it's out there, by the way, so it can't come back and haunt you. Does that make sense? So yeah, you read it and you're like, oh, that's kind of gross. And it is. I don't want to do that. But it's this beautiful picture of how do I deal with all of my sin? Right? Not just the sin of I did something and I feel guilty because I hurt that person. Right? What do I do with the sin where I feel bad about it and I didn't mean to do it? Has anybody ever said something that you regret saying? And then someone confronts you and you're like, I didn't mean it like that. Now, did that count as an apology? And they go, oh, well, you didn't mean it like that? No problem. Yeah, that usually just escalates things, right? You didn't mean it, though, right? And you probably believe in your heart, like, I know I didn't really mean to say something that hurt you or do something that hurt you. That's an accidental transgression. That's what the chatat offering is for. How do I get clean of the things I didn't mean to do, that I feel ashamed about? I can't believe I did that. And God says, here's an offering. And here's what I'm going to do with your shame and your sin and your guilt. Something's going on outside.
It's okay. It's the youth. It's the youth.
Oh. We'll make a chatat offering for them later. Okay.
It was totally well placed.
Okay. I'll cut that part out.
What a job on your timing.
Yeah. Right. So God is saying here in the offering, here's what I'm going to do with that sin that you're ashamed of, that you're carrying around of, like, I didn't mean to, and I feel so terrible about it. I'm taking it away. I'm going to take it outside the camp. I'm going to get rid of it and all of its disgusting and ugliness. I'm going to burn it so it can't come back. All right? And we need that. We need both the sacrifice and the offering that forgives the sins that I intentionally did. I sinned bad. I need the payment. I also need to be made clean from all my shame of the things that I did wrong that I didn't even mean to. Like, and I just, right, you ask yourself, like, what was I thinking? Like, why did I do that? Like, if you ever wondered that about yourself, that's the accidental transgression. Like, we even have this in our liturgy, right? The things that I did, things that I left undid, oopsies, I should have done that. Now why am I not a better person, right? We call them sins, and if you take confirmation, sins of commission and, oh, yay, look at all the good Lutherans. Don't worry about feeling guilty about that. God loves you and forgives you for it too. Right? And that's the point of this offering. God cleanses you of everything that makes you unclean and ashamed. And he takes it out of the camp, meaning he's physically like moving it out of your sight, saying, it's not you anymore. That's not yours. All right. The other really neat thing about this is, if you read the details of this offering, it's the procedures are different for everybody. Right? God comes up with a way for every single person, whether they're a leader, so an elder in their community, you're a priest or the high priest, you're an individual, or my favorite is if the whole community was like, oh, the golden calf, that was a big oopsies. They make it together, right? So God provide. The beauty of Leviticus is God is saying, I'm providing a way for everybody to have their sins taken away from them, for all their uncleanliness to be made clean. It doesn't matter if you're the high priest all the way down to regular layperson and you can only bring 2 turtle doves, right? That's the beauty of this. All right. So the purpose of this offering was to deal with sin, but also to remove defilement in a more general sense, right? So that's what I'm saying. Like, if you read later on Leviticus, where they start using this sacrifice for, ceremonial things too. All right. A way of thinking about it is, and I wrote it down for you, is because we're New Testament Christians. Think about it as like, this is the sacrifice for the lost sheep. So some of the language that's used in Leviticus 4 for this offering in the Hebrew has to do with being wayward. So if you think of a sheep belongs to the flock, I always chuckle. We talk about being sheep, right? It's a beautiful image. Y'all know sheep are dumb, right? Yeah. Okay, good. It's not like God's picked like the most intelligent animal on the planet. Says, that's what my people are like. He's like, you know who's dumb and stubborn and gets lost a lot? Sheep. And that's what I'm going to call you, because I love you. Now, the good news is he's a shepherd that does love us, and he chases us down when we're going to hurt ourselves or do foolish things, right? I know that it can be a little tricky to have this term like accidental transgressions. So just think about this offering as a sacrifice for the lost sheep. You're a sheep. You belong to God. You're part of his flock. But you wandered off. You got a little wayward. And he's giving you a way to get back home. He's bringing you back to the flock, all right? Which is a very common picture of Jesus in the New Testament, right? He chases after the one that gets lost and brings it home. All right, last one for the day. This is the guilt offering. So you have the sin offering. We just looked at the chatat. And now you have the asham, the guilt offering, sometimes called the trespass offering. And this is the one where you messed up, you sinned, you broke one of God's rules, you hurt someone else, you got guilt, right? You know it. So the chatat was sometimes brought for unknown sins, right? Sins of omission. I messed up. I didn't mean to. My bad. And you get cleansed of it, right? The guilt offering is for specific sins. And it gets very long. You can read the whole chapter on your own. It starts in Leviticus 5, verse 14, goes on for quite a while. Because God's like, if you do this thingy, you got to come to me and make this sacrifice. And if you do this, you got to, right, it's, the chatat's a little more general. Like, oh, okay, we're all bad. The guilt offering is, I feel guilty because I did this thing that was wrong against God or my neighbor. Does that make sense, the distinction? Okay. It's sometimes called the trespass offering, and I bring that up for a specific reason. The whole point of this was to remove our guilt of being in debt to God, which is, again, in Romans, Paul says, the wages of sin, the payment, the debt of sin is death. You owe God a death because of sin. The sacrifice becomes the death in your place. All right? You might be familiar with something called the Lord's Prayer. Now, it depends on which translation you grew up with, right? Some say debt, as we forget our debtors. That's the version my grandfather used to always sing, and he was a really good singer. He got trained at the Frankfurt Opera House in Germany. And I didn't inherit those genes. My brother and my father can sing amazingly. They're really good singers. My mom and I sound like a cat got caught in a car engine, but we're praising the Lord with our hearts, so it's okay. All right? But he used to sing the Lord's Prayer. It's this beautiful rendition. He would do it as a solo in church. He got to sing it at my brother's wedding. And it used the debt and debtors, right? You might be more familiar with the translation that says trespasses and, those who trespass against us. Did you ever wonder, why did Jesus say debt and debtors and trespasses? It's because he read Leviticus. Technically, he kind of wrote Leviticus because he's God. I get that. Right. And it goes back to the guilt offering language. It's meant to, it's an offering it takes care of the debt that I owe God because of my guilt and sin. I did something wrong. I broke one of his rules, one of his commands. I'm guilty. I owe him for it. I make this offering and sacrifice. So Jesus puts into the Lord's Prayer this language that says, forgive my debts. He's not talking about the financial debt you owe God. He's talking about the guilt offering debt. He's saying, God, forgive my debts just like I forgive my debtors, the people that owe me. And we all know that feeling of when someone sins against you, of wanting to make them pay. Right? We even have that language. I'm going to make them pay. Where did it come from? Well, you didn't know it, but it comes from Leviticus. We're like, I owe this debt for guilt. They owe me a debt for guilt. And God, and Jesus in the Lord's Prayer is trying to teach you, this is how God forgives your sins. God has taken care of your debt. So you turn around and go ahead and forgive their debt. If you ever remember the parable of the something that's called the shrewd manager, right? He owes a huge debt and it's forgiven. And then he runs and he finds someone that owes him an even smaller debt that's minuscule, and he doesn't forgive it. And he gets called evil and shrewd. The whole point of that parable is Jesus teaching you the economy of God's grace. As my professors at seminary would call it. It's the economy of God's grace. He forgives the debts that we owe him. And so in light of that, out of his grace and mercy, we live changed lives, so we're able to forgive the debts that are owed to us. Now, there is this language, if you read about it, of it being a ram, a sacrificial ram, which were crazy expensive and like the most expensive kind of animal then, which is why it was used for special things like Day of Atonement, all right? And we'll talk about that coming up. Not today, but in coming weeks. So there's this language of purchase a ram and everything. So what most scholars say is that obviously the average person didn't have a ram. So what you would do is the tabernacle, the priests had them there. There was like communal, and you would purchase it. You would give them money as your offering and say, okay, now this ram counts as yours. Which, by the way, because of sinful human hearts, eventually leads to money changers in the temple taking advantage of people so they can no longer receive the offerings and the sacrifices from God to get their sins forgiven, which is why now you know, because of Leviticus, why Jesus got so dang angry, made a whip and beat people and flipped their tables over and kicked them out. Because their money changing was extorting people like this coming to worship God and preventing them from being able to do it and have their sins forgiven. And Jesus says, no, 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 no. Anybody that comes to God gets their sins forgiven. You don't get in the way of that. All right.
Would the ram in this case be killed or not?
Yes.
Oh, it would.
Oh, yeah. You don't want to be an animal in Leviticus.
Well, the way that you said, they would have rams that you could...
Yeah, meaning,
I just didn't know.
The average person didn't have a ram at home, so you're not going to, travel there. So
the ram was killed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, real quick, in Luke 19, there's a very famous story. Yes?
So did every person have to have an animal for sacrifice?
So there's debate about that. Technically, according to the rules of Leviticus, yeah. That's why you see in the New Testament, I keep mentioning it, Mary and Joseph bringing turtle doves because they were poor. That was like the low-income animal to make a sacrifice because God was trying to allow anybody, no matter who you were, to be able to worship him properly, right? So you'd have the wealthy people bring in calves or cattle, goats, lambs, and then all the way down to birds. There is historical and debate about how faithfully did the Israelites actually live out Leviticus, right? Because eventually they start wandering in the wilderness. And you also get biblical evidence that they probably weren't so great at it, to be honest, because you get to Joshua and they're getting ready to enter the promised land, and they do Passover for the first time in decades because there's a whole generation, and Joshua's like, well, you guys haven't been circumcised, and we haven't done Passover in a while. So we should do those things because God told us to before we enter the promised land, right? So technically, yeah, according to what God's word says here in Leviticus, they should have been doing these things. You also have to remember, these were not done daily, all right? Now, later on in Leviticus, as I said, it repeats. There's some, the burnt offering, the priests would make a communal burnt offering in the morning and in the evening for the whole people. So it's not like the whole tribe every single day, please bring in your ram or your goat or your sheep and kill it. All right. So yeah, there's just debate about how accurately and faithfully did they actually follow these rules and regulations. We don't know because we weren't there. The other thing too, though, is we read it as we go to church every week. So we're like, oh, well, you worship God every week, so you go into the tabernacle. It wasn't necessarily like that, where they were making these sacrifices and offerings every single day or every single week. It was probably more so when they felt like the occasion called for it, kind of thing. So probably not as many animals were being sacrificed numerically as we might think on the first reading of they must have been doing this every day. They probably weren't. All right, so with the Isham, with the debts, again, I'm trying to bring New Testament stories to make it a little more familiar for you. There's a man named Zacchaeus, and I hate the song, but Zacchaeus, cool story. What's his problem? Y'all remember? He's a tax collector. He's a chief tax collector, which means he's been extorting his people like crazy. He climbs the tree because he's got no friends. He sees Jesus. Jesus sees him and he says, Zacchaeus, come down. I must eat with you tonight. And Zacchaeus and a whole bunch of his tax collector friends, because they're the only ones that he would be friends with him, are at dinner at Zacchaeus' house, and Jesus eats with them. And Zacchaeus repents, right? Now, the part of the story we all hold on to is the very famous line from Jesus where he says, I came to seek and to save the lost. Just true for the wandering sheep. So Zacchaeus, though, makes this great statement to Jesus right as his act of repentance. To anybody that I've done this to, I will pay them back. To anybody that I've done this to, I will pay them back fivefold. If you read some of the regulations and specifications of the Asham offering, God says you will pay people back 5 times what you took from them. This is an offering meant to do what? Cleanse you of your guilt and forgive your sins. So Zacchaeus says that statement, and every good Lutheran goes, well, we're not saved by works. We're saved by grace. Because what is Jesus' response to Zacchaeus when he says that great statement? Today salvation has come to your house. I came to seek and save the lost. And every good Lutheran is like, it doesn't make any sense because, we're saved by God's grace. Yeah, we are. And Zacchaeus and Jesus knew the book of Leviticus. And in Leviticus, God says, when you make this offering, you will repay 5 times what you took. Zacchaeus says, I'm going to do it. It's an even greater. And it's an offering and sacrifice instituted by God to bring about what? Your forgiveness for your guilt. And so Jesus' response to Zacchaeus is, you're forgiven. Salvation belongs to you. Because I came for the lost sheep. And you wandered around, and you got really lost, Zacchaeus. But God forgives you. All right? That's part of Leviticus. I hope you're learning something.